This is Brian, and this is Mark. Brian and Mark are best friends. No, they're not just best friends, they're like brothers. This is Charlie. Charlie is the barman. Since Brian and Mark do not have a lot of money, they owe people a lot of stuff. But Mark especially is willing to do anything to get some extra money. But Mark has a special power. He can get anyone to do anything. This is Eminem. Eminem is Brian and Mark's best friend, but they treat him like a younger brother. One day, Brian, Mark, and Eminem were bowling. They were having a good time until Eminem decided to leave early. As soon as Brian and Mark came out of the bowling alley, they saw that Eminem was getting jumped by 3 hoodlums. Immediately, Brian and Mark start fighting the hoodlums to scare them away. Turns out these hoodlums were part of the Shepherd's gang. The events that happen in these scenes show that Mark and Brian are willing to do anything to protect Eminem. Mark is not the type of person that thinks twice about what he's going to say, so sometimes his words hurt people. When Mark said this, Eminem got very upset and started crying. Eminem says that it's wrong to beat someone because of the color of their skin. After he got jumped, Eminem decides to leave and go home. After this whole thing, Brian goes to visit his mother at the hospital. His mother's at the hospital because of some undefined surgeries. Surgeries are expensive, and since Mark and Brian do not have money, they have to sell their car and their television to be able to afford the surgeries. Mark is usually the one that brings the money home. And since Brian and his mother know that most of the money is stolen, they never question where it comes from. Mark and Brian were at the pool hall when they suddenly challenged 2 Texans to play a game of pool. As per usual, Mark and Brian won the game. Mark and Brian were happy. The Texans, not so much. When Mark and Brian leave the pool hall, they find themselves trapped by the 2 Texans. One of the Texans was holding a gun, and the other one was wearing brass knuckles. Out of nowhere, Charlie appears with a shotgun ready to protect Mark and Brian. Right as the Texans are running away, one turns around and decides to shoot Charlie in the head. Texans killed Charlie. When the police arrive to the crime scene, they tell Brian and Mark that they can keep Charlie's car. But Brian and Mark feel extremely guilty about causing this whole outrage. Time passes, and Brian gets a girlfriend. And as Brian and his girlfriend Kathy grow closer together, Mark and Brian grow farther apart. Brian even states, "I was changing, and he wasn't." This means that Brian was maturing and that Mark was still the same naive young boy that he's always been. After some suspicion that Eminem might be smoking marijuana, he runs away from home. For 7 straight days, they tried looking for Eminem with no luck in finding him. One day, Mark tells Brian that he knows where Eminem is, and that he will take him as soon as he could. On the next day, Mark takes Brian to the house where Eminem supposedly was. When they got to the house, Brian noticed that there were peace signs all over, and a sign by the front porch that read, "Love." As soon as they walked into the house, they figured out that everyone was smoking marijuana. And by everyone, I mean children. When they finally find Eminem, they take him to the hospital, where he rests unconscious. Doctors tell Brian and Kathy that Eminem might never be the same again. Brian goes home. Brian wanted a cigarette to take care of the stress, and he looks where he always looks, under Mark's bed. When he puts his hand in, he finds pills. He realizes that these weren't any antibiotics. These were drugs. Brian was angry, and he calls 911. A few moments later, when Mark gets to the house, Brian starts telling him about everything that happened. Mark keeps trying to justify by saying that he never took any, and he never gave any to Eminem. He kept trying to justify it by saying that he needed the money. Brian tells Mark the sad truth, that the police are on their way. In shock, Mark does nothing. A couple months passed by before Brian went to visit Mark again. Mark lost weight, and he now has the look of a cold-blooded killer. When he sees him, Brian tells Mark that he needs to behave so he can come home. With a crude and cold look, he tells Brian that he will never go back home again. Brian is sad and confused about how much Mark has changed. Brian finishes up with a book by saying that he would love to be a kid again, when he had all the answers. The end.